We understand at Kentucky, Tennessee Living that many of the views that we expose in history are not always popular or goes against the grain. We have heard it over and over again. Why dredge up the past? Simply put, we are all looking backwards in time and looking through the lenses of those who have tried to answer these questions before us. While we read these books and articles, we have also taken the view, in our storytelling, that we take the actual documentation, whether by court records, eyewitness statements, newspaper articles of the day, and other such documentation that occurred between the years of 1880 and 1901 in Appalachian history. All we can say is hold on to your bonnets and hats, because the story of Talt Hall is a complicated one. Whenever the name of Thomas Talton or Bad Talt Hall is brought up in conversation, everyone immediately goes to one of two points in history. It is either the Pound Gap Massacre or the murder of Enos Hilton. But there was so much more to the man. Did he really kill as many as 99 men, or could it have been as he said, and only 6 men died at his hand? 6 men would face the gallows of Wise County, Virginia, and Talt Hall would have the distinction of being the very first one. But was he the actual person who history says needed to be there? While history tells us that he did not have any direct or indirect involvement in the Pound Gap Massacre, the fact that there was supposed to be a personal animosity between Hall and Dr. Taylor would play out for over 130 years. But was this really fact or fiction? The question has always been asked, were they really as big of enemies as everyone thinks that they were? And with the newspapers of the day in hand, we will take a look at the possibilities that the journalists of that time also asked. And was there also a second man named Little Talt Hall that was of no relation to him, and is thought to be the man behind many of the crimes to which Thomas Talton has been accused for over 130 plus years? Who was this person, and why is there not a lot of information available about him? Was he the leader of a gang or part of a raging second feud that was going on in Letcher County, Kentucky? What happened between Talt Hall and Enos Hilton that led to the gallows? And what did Bad John Wright and Talt Hall really say to each other in the jail? So it is that time again that we all board the time machine to go back in time to find out more about Thomas Talton Hall. But before I start, I need your help. I can drive the time machine and do the narration, but I need you to push the like, subscribe, and bell buttons to get the time machine started. This helps us out so that we can get a bigger time machine and take more people with us. And without further ado, here we go. Thomas Talton Hall's early years and family. Sometime in October of 1849 or in the year of 1850, other sources list the date as being 1846, at Little Carr in Letcher County, Kentucky, Thomas Talton was born to Anna Johnson and David Hall. He would marry Miranda or Renda Triplett Hall October 12, 1868, in Letcher County, Kentucky, and have 3 children, Marilyn, Eveline, and Sophia. Miranda was born the same year as Talton Hall and was a twin to Marilda Triplett and daughter of Wilson and Eleanor Isaac Triplett. Toward the end of his life, Talt would take up with the widow Saylers and was in a relationship with her at the time of his arrest. Her name is never given in any of the documents that we could find. We will get more into this relationship later on in our story, as well as what happened to his legal wife and children. His infamous cousins were John Bad Lewis Hall and Elijah Henry Redbill Hall. Assistant to the Deputy United States Marshal. There seems to be evidence at one time that Thomas Talton was a U.S. Marshal's deputy assistant and was very respected in the community of Floyd County. At that time, a sheriff or U.S. Marshal could choose any well-abled man to serve as deputy for a short amount of time. Hall served for several months, some sources say 2 years, and he either left his post voluntarily or couldn't work longer because of his trouble with the law. According to the December 18th, 1891, the Evening Bulletin, Captain Heflin was a deputy United States Marshal and had employed Hall for several months to ferret out the illicit distilleries of eastern Kentucky. According to the newspaper, Colonel George Simmons, who was a newspaper man, was with Heflin hunting for moonshiners one evening. The pair got separated from the other. Simmons had heard a noise in the bush and had to drop on Talt Hall. Simmons took Hall to Heflin by gunpoint to take him to be arrested. Heflin remarked that it was quite the surprise to see one of his assistants under arrest and in the custody of the other assistant. Could this very thing cause Hall to quit his job? Now we have to ask these questions. If this is true that he was a former U.S. Marshal's assistant, what may he have said, if anything, on the return trip from Memphis to Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor, that he made him give up his badge as soon as Talt Hall's trial was over? What happened to make both men want to give up hunting moonshine steals and runners? And what may Talt have said to Doc that made him suspicious of those that were holding power in the area? While we will never know the answers to these questions, the actions of Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor after this event says that something happened or was said between the two men. Henry Maggard. According to the website Find a Grave, in 1866, during the Civil War, Hall sided with the Confederacy. During that time, the Appalachian Mountains were split on their loyalties upon that war, so you had family and friends that sided with the North and the others who sided with the South. Henry Maggard sided with the Union. It is said that Hall killed Maggard for siding with the North, and that was the only reason behind that action. According to the Valley Virginian, on September 8, 1892, Hall was acquitted of the cold-blooded murder of Henry Maggard in 1866. Hall would go on and admit this killing before his death. Other murders. Talton Hall had been suspected in the murder of 19 men in Perry County. Although a large reward was offered for his capture and arrest, no one wanted to go after Hall because of his reputation. According to the Valley Virginian, on September 8, 1892, there was a list of men that Hall was reported to have slain. Quote, he killed Daniel Pridemore in 1875 and was acquitted. A cowardly jury acquitted him of Nat Baker's murder in 1881. And he went free when he murdered his brother-in-law, Henry Triplett, in 1882. He killed Henry Hoke in 1883 and was indicted. But no officer dared to arrest him. Unquote. According to the Appalachian Quarterly, Hall would confirm that he had killed Henry Maggard, Henry Hoke, Mack Hall, and a man named Triplett. He was acquitted in all of these cases. Mack Hall and Ab Little. According to the Daily Evening Bulletin published on December 21, 1885, Talt Hall was on the run, and 3 members of his gang were under arrest for the murders of Mack Hall and Ab Little that occurred the previous June. The men under arrest were William J. Bates, Miles Bates, and George Johnson, all from Floyd County, Kentucky. Mack Hall and Little had gotten into a fight with the gang. Hall was shot in the leg, and Little was killed while he was trying to rescue him. According to the Valley Virginian on September 8, 1892, Talt Hall laughed at the sheriff who tried to arrest him for the murder of his cousin, Mack Hall. A $1,500 reward was offered for the capture and arrest of Talt Hall. The arrested members of the gang who were already in custody had to be moved because there were 2 parties that were planning to free them from jail. One party wanted to free them because they were members of their gang. The other parties were also members of their gang that wanted to hang them rather than to see them escape justice. It is not clear what happened to the gang members after this article. If there was ever a moment in someone's life when the events could be pointed to for a downward spiral for Talt Hall, it would be the death of Frank Saylers. Not only would this event be the pivot point for Talt Hall, it would also spark a feud that would last for many years in Letcher County, Kentucky, between himself and Clabe Jones. Hall would never mention this event or even admit that he was the one that caused it to happen. However, according to the Hartfield Herald, published on June 10, 1885, quote, last week Todd Hall, a desperado, and one of his fellows named Johnson, shot and killed Frank Sayler in his own doorway because he objected to Hall's intimacy with his wife, Sayler's wife. At the coroner's inquest the following day, Hall, the murderer, took exception to the selection of Claiborne Jones as juryman. Jones resented this, and the two got their friends and fought in an open field. 2 of the Hall faction were killed and several were wounded. Unquote. However, according to the Hazel Green Herald on June 3, 1885, quote, the origin of the trouble is said to be the killing of a man by the name of Sayler sometime last March in Floyd County, at which time Jones charged that Hall was responsible for the murder. Unquote. Also, according to this same paper, Hall's love for the wife of Saylers was not the only motive for killing him. Quote, on March 6 last, this party, believing that Frank Saylers, a prominent man of this section, had money, made a dash for his home, and would have immediately murdered him but for the timely interference of J.C. Jones, an old and respected citizen of that county, who persuaded them to go away and spare his life. They left at that hour, but returned later in the evening and murdered Saylers and robbed him of what money he had. Unquote. Now, when I first read these articles, I was scratching my head. Why on earth would Todd Hall take an exception to Claiborne Jones being on his jury? And why would it come down to a huge fight out in an open field? Besides, I had never heard of this trouble in Letcher County before this point. So I went onward with the investigation, and this is what I found so far. The Hall and Jones feud. As we have stated, the feud between Todd Hall and Clabe Jones lasted for quite some time. Each side had some 20 to 30 men following them. According to the Hazel Green Herald on June 3, 1885, the accusation of Hall killing Saylers caused Hall to go after Jones. Quote, this caused Hall, who has killed 2 or 3 men, to put on his war paint and go in quest of Jones' scalp. The latter, being apprised of Hall's movements, rallied his friends, and Hall had to take the defensive. A few days ago, the Hall party were driven into the house by Jones and his men, and since then the war has raged in earnest. Hall and his men were still fortified in the house, which is surrounded by Jones and his followers. On several occasions, the Hall party attempted to fight their way out, but were driven back. So far, 5 men have been killed and several others wounded. No person is allowed to pass through the neighborhood, and those living in the immediate vicinity are fleeing for safety. The greatest excitement prevails. Hall and his men cannot get any assistance from their friends, while Jones' party are being reinforced daily, and it is only a question of time, and a short period too, until Hall and his party will be exterminated. Unquote. According to the Hartford Herald on June 10, 1885, the trouble between the 2 factions was still not over. Quote, matters are still in unsettled condition in Knott County. There are 2 opposing factions led by Todd Hall and Clabe Jones, and each have 20 or 30 followers. They have had several fights, and 5 or 6 men have been killed. It seems that the cause of the difficulty is the murder of Frank Saylers, a rich farmer, by the band of desperadoes. Hall and his men are fortified in a house, and the end is not yet. Unquote. During this fight, another feud was going on between the Wrights and the Jones factions. The Wright and Jones feud. There seems to have been a heap of trouble in Letcher County in 1885. While we will have more about this when we cover Bad or Devil John Wright and Clabe Jones in our series, in this story we will cover the broad strokes, as it will explain a lot about the relationship between Todd Hall and John Wright. According to the Hazel Green Herald from Wolfe County, Kentucky, in their October 28, 1885 edition, there was a three-way feud going on in Letcher County. The players were the Wright family, captained by John Wright, the Jones family, headed by Deputy Sheriff Dolph Drawn, and the Hall family, which Talt Hall was captain. According to the article, John Wright hated Deputy Sheriff Dolph Drawn, and at one point asked the governor of the state of Kentucky to come and cage him. Both Wright and Drawn were of considerable wealth and influence in the county, while the newspaper also says that Hall had a property as well. While according to the article, Hall and Wright were not acting in unison with each other, they were both working against Drawn and his faction and resisting arrest. The article goes on to say that all of the men in this trouble were related to and hated each other. The article goes on to say that while it was a complicated matter between the men on how the actual feud got started, the rift was helped along with the murder of Frank Sayler, and it became an outbreak of violence. However, according to the Mountain Feuds of Kentucky article, the writer Noah Reynolds states that the feud that Wright had with Jones started over the murder of Linville Higgins. Bad John Wright was accused of being part of the shooting and refused to submit to the custody of Deputy Sheriff Drawn. According to the same article, Deputy Sheriff Drawn gathered together a posse of about 30 men to arrest Wright. They were ambushed on the way to carry out their duties and, quote, a general fight ensued, in which several men were wounded, one of which, the noted Talt Hall, received a severe and painful wound in the shoulder. He belonged to the Wright faction, unquote. According to the Appalachian Quarterly, September 1998, quote, old Dave Hall, father of Talton Hall, had been considered as a suspect in the murder of Linville Higgins. However, Dave Hall, who was also the father of Andrew Hall, had no part in the killing, other than possibly relishing the death of one of the gang that had murdered his son. 3 men were indicted for the Higgins murder, one of which was positively identified as Wash Craft of Letcher County. 2 other suspects were Sam Wright and Benjamin Jones, unquote. According to the New York Times, for the Wright side of the feud, it was quelled on September 19, 1885, when the fight escalated and Deputy Sheriff Drawn, Sam Cook, and William Francis were killed. However, for Talt Hall, the fight was not over and would continue between his side and the Jones for many years. As for Wright and Hall, they would become best friends after this point in their history. Again, we will cover more about the Wright and Jones feud when we cover both men in our Appalachian Outlaw series. For now, we are trying to stay focused on Talt Hall and his part of the story. While we're going to stop at this moment, we will pick up next week with the death of Elkerton Turner and Enos Hilton, the trial, his feud with Taylor in the jailhouse, and Talt's death. We are finding out more and more each day about him, and this is too big of a story to tell in a short amount of time. Special thank yous. We wish to once again thank those who have helped us to gather information about people in this series. We at Kentucky, Tennessee Living could not do the amount of research and storytelling that we do without the help of some great historians and friends. We have a special list today of people that we wish to thank. Forgive me if I mispronounce your names. I'm going by how they are said in the mountains, so if there is a different way to say it, I apologize beforehand. I also want to make sure everyone is accounted for. If your name is not on the list, send me a message on the Facebook page, and you will be added in Part 2 of Talt Hall. Thank you to Eileen Williams Sanders, Randall Osborne, John White Sr., Vicki McPeak Sackett, John Johnson, Mark Wade Baldwin, Judy Bach, William Taylor, Catherine Melinda Melton, Charles Broyles, Diana Sloan Moore, Joe Johnson, Teresa Reynolds Horn, Dwight Collins, Kevin Hall, Virgie Cogan, Rebecca and Johnny Mullins, Connie Hall Boggs, Frida Stewart, and a very special thank you to Hillary S. Clark. Thank you. We at Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the Appalachian Outlaws. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell for notification. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries of Appalachian history.